All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to SCI-Arc. Whether you're here in the building with us or tuning on in online from somewhere else in the planet, you're very welcome to be here with me, John Cooper, co-coordinator of History and Theory at SCI-Arc, and our own Damjan Jovanovic, who is design faculty here and co-creator of the extraordinary exhibition that we have right now, Discovery, with your design partner, Lidija Kljakovic, with whom you are directors of the design agency lifeforms.io. So,
thank you. Your Serbian is amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you know, I've been, you know. It's an extraordinary exhibition. I think we all know that. It's totally changed the atmosphere of SCI-Arc. We're walking around and we hear its soundtrack kind of vibrating out of the gallery space. It's there in the background. It's added a new kind of layer to this world. And whenever I go to the exhibition or walk past the gallery, there's often kind of people coming out of the exhibition or going in to seek a kind of refuge. And I'm sure people here, I think I've seen a few you in there chilling out on the beanbags. It's a world-making project, but it's kind of erected and established a bit of a new world here at SCI-Arc, also in terms of the way the gallery is used and the feeling of the place. So I wonder if we might kind of start our discussion here about the world making. And you know, one of the standout features of the gallery exhibition is not only that it has a giant projection of a kind of 48-minute film sequence taken from within the simulated model environment that makes up Discovery. And there are game consoles and interfaces outside too. But there is an extraordinary blimp floating in the SCI-Arc gallery space, and this gives a wonderful presence. But it also is the blimp is also the primary vessel of the TAC, the Airborne Collective, right? Who is the main kind of protagonist of your realm. So, you know, it'd be great if you. I wonder if you could introduce us to the Airborne Collective, who they are and what they're up to.
Right. So this starts, I think, with this idea of world making, which might be something that I'd like to maybe just explain a little bit what the concept behind that is. I was actually interested to maybe kind of go away a little bit from this concept of world building, which is maybe more kind of commercially oriented idea, and it's well established, like how that is happening in the, let's say, in the video game industry and so forth. But I think world making has more to do with this question of how you extend like a simulated environment in the physical space, and how you then also offer like different speeds of experience or different durations of experience. And that's where this idea of collective comes from, is what if you don't design like one building, but what if you design a collection of kind of related, you know, artifacts, characters, and then robots, and then different kinds of ideas that all kind of come together in this collective. And then what if you also extend that to the idea of the audience? So the audience becomes part of the work, and that's kind of the collective, right? It's not really so much about you know, kind of creating a fictional collective that is then is a story about them, but I think it's a story about all of us. And that's where the blimp is so important, because it's kind of, for me at least, the blimp is the symbol of LA and this idea of optimism, really. And that when I see that Goodyear blimp that always goes around, then I always thought that was kind of the future. That's an interesting future to me, much more interesting than some of the more dystopian kind of outcomes of kind of thinking about the future of Los Angeles, right? So how to, you know, this is kind of the whole thing of world making. So how to connect all of that stuff, and how to produce something that works as an installation in a certain space, but that also works beyond that as more like an idea, right? So what we did is we kind of envisioned the collective to be really something that can kind of keep on living beyond through different other things that we want to design as well, and maybe even kind of it could even have like a commercial idea behind it at some point, or even enter different regimes like fashion and other things. But so the idea behind the collective is really comes from something that, comes from two maybe sources. One is the pandemic era, right? The 2 years that everyone spent in their homes, and because we live in downtown LA, we kind of spent a lot of time on the rooftops during the pandemic. It was kind of empty. It was really an interesting new collection of people that emerged, and some of them started doing alternative kind of gardening practices, and you might imagine, right? Like different kinds of ideas there. But then the other thing is that this pandemic, the destabilization of the world through the pandemic, kind of triggered something that Lidija and I both have, which is our experience of the 1990s and the kind of the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the breakdown and everything that happened there. And this idea that one can find maybe some new ways of living through kind of, at that time, this was the introduction of kind of very early internet, electronic music, the hacking community, right? This kind of aesthetics that goes with that. And that's where like the core of that project really comes from, I think. So that kind of weird kind of repetition of the 90s vibe, but on a different, like much nicer actually scale here, to be honest, in LA. This is kind of maybe at the collective. So I was then thinking like, okay, so once we do it in the gallery, it becomes really, everyone becomes part of this. Yeah. It's like a rave.
Yeah, right.
But we didn't want to actually put music there. Like, so we kind of thought about the soundscape as being this kind of immersive, in addition to the film. But then the soundscape becomes this kind of hypnotic kind of presence, and the blimp has this kind of like white noise sound that's actually just the air that's circulating. And that's something really soothing, I think. This is what I like to, when I go in the space like this, the feeling that you're kind of dislodged into this other world. So that's the world-making idea, I think, kind of an extended idea.
And I feel like the blimp is such a perfect figure for that, because you're speaking of like being dislodged from the world we're in to another, and there's a certain way in which the blimp is untethered.
Yes.
It's not tied to place or to modes of viewing or spectatorship in the way that the kind of anthropocentric eye, and for that matter, the eye of the architect, which is so kind of conditioned within somewhat normatized ways of seeing, whether it's like perspective or linear rationalized space. I feel like the blimp is free of that.
Yeah.
And I think the way that it hovers over the city in the sequence, and you can kind of see that on the film right now, that it doesn't conform to any standard ways of viewing the city as an urban formation. And that seems like related to the formation of a politics.
Yes.
There's a way of seeing and representing which was related to a specific spatial regime, and it seems that the blimp is the insertion of an alternative.
Yes.
At like a different scale, it moves differently. And, in a certain way, I feel like it makes the underlying orthographic model of the city obsolete, or at least like aged. Where I feel like when we're in the city, we're in a world kind of without us being the human as it's currently constructed. I think that also plays into the aesthetics, which are like so seductive and alluring. But I feel they're not just that. The palette, and also when you go into the exhibition space, right, you're kind of bathed in this light.
Yeah.
It kind of avatarizes you, it turns you into, I feel like, a future version of oneself. And this like gentle neon graffiti that covers the city, the iridescence of the like solar film that covers all of these bioluminescent caterpillar, larvae, pupating kind of creatures that encrust the world is in such stark contrast, I think, to the sort of hideous nullity of the capitalist city as it is and as it exists in this model. Those kind of design decisions to make the skin like that, they must have been like the subject of a lot of thinking and a lot of referencing and...
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly right. I think there is a few questions in that question, I think, and maybe I can start from just the city model, which is basically the whole project is done in Unreal Engine, and there is one model that is kind of was introduced last year, where it's actually a simulated city environment that is quite generic, and there is maybe something that we wanted to do is as you're saying, maybe kind of infect that idea with this like other world, or you know, that is manifested through all these different like visual cues and aesthetic kind of markers, I think, but I think what you said at the beginning was also this idea that there's so many references in this film, and basically one thing that is actually happening here, and I wanted to kind of just dispel that for some. I had some questions like, is it an automated kind of camera that looks at this space, or is it? It's actually a gameplay recording. It's like 48 minutes, and what is interesting there, that to me that was kind of maybe a new way of seeing that requires like a fully simulated environment for it to be kind of in any way kind of believable, right? So this new way of seeing, as you describe it, it's basically a drone view, or it's a view from the kind of some height, and is challenging this idea also that because there is no cut, there is no montage. Yeah. It's like one take. So it challenges this idea coming from maybe history of film, that city can be experienced as as kind of a collection of fragments, coming from like cinema verite and people like Vertov in Soviet Union, and the man with the movie camera. This idea that film at that time didn't have language, so they had to invent it. But the way that they were inventing it is just by going to the city and exploring it from different views, like any kind of view would.
But that's why it seems to me that what you're in a position now where you're unmaking the cinematic language that came after that Vertovian moment, because so many forms of narrative incrustation built up and outwards from that yes. moment. And this seems to me a project of unbuilding those. It's
unbuilding insofar as it follows the language of video games, really. And this is interesting because games can do that. In games, you can have a continuous experience of any space. And I find that fascinating because that challenges, this is why games are fundamental, I think, for architecture, because they challenge the notions of how we understand architectural space from like the get-go, right? And especially, this is kind of what influences the design then of these kind of greenhouses and other things we have, because they become nested spaces, like bubbles inside bubbles inside bubbles. And then this is what drives also the kind of the pattern work, because the pattern work can be observed now in different ways, and it can have that intensity of scale, or kind of.
And you can move through scales.
And you can move through scales.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was so interesting because some of my kind of architectural references, like Bernard Tschumi, who
appears.
His work appears as a billboard in the city, actually. And that's kind of an interesting thing because his project was about like dislodging or disjunction coming from the cinematic idea of space. And I think now we have the simulation as a mode of seeing. That's what I'm working on in some of these works. And then obviously the other one when we get there is even going beyond that. But yeah. What was the third question? Was something was implied there.
One thing, but what I think I want to get onto there, but building on what you're saying, is because next to the Shumi advertisement on the street, when the lead character is kind of walking around, there's another set of advertisements with House Rooker,
yes,
masks and things on, and I wonder, in a sense, that to me that betrays a sensibility where you've been looking through histories of architecture, like radical architecture, like looking for ancestors.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
Looking for exploring the discipline to see where you can pick up stories that are there and like take them on. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly right, and I think this is what I would say, teachers, and So another thing is that the second album of Daft Punk is called Discovery, right? And on the first album, you have this song called Teachers, which actually goes through their influences in their work. And I think this is why this film actually starts from this kind of series of billboards, like Super Studio, and Chumi and House Rooker and Archizoom and Archigram at one point. And then the Discovery, when the blimp appears, that's where you kind of go to the second. Well, this is one of the kind of conspiratorial layers that we can talk about later. But you're right. I think it's very much inspired by that. But it's actually formally and in this idea of world making is really inspired by John Haydock and his or let's say the reading that one can have of his work through the lens of making a world. And in his case, it's a world of characters, almost like in a theatrical play. And in this case, it's basically a world of characters in a video game that have a relation, right? So it's interesting. Whoever I ask about John Haydock, no one really likes Haydock so much, but I love John Haydock's work, especially like the later, like weird part, or weird kind of phase where he was into poetry, and I thought it was kind of like an interesting phase in someone who was a modern, kind of a modernist, and then went through that. But we can talk about that later when we get to the second, like the game part, which is really the game part is like John Haydock meets Dungeons and Dragons.
I mean, let's talk about it now. So the exhibition is part game. It's playable. So we switched. So it's the same world, but it's a different world. How do you correlate the film to these games?
This is, if like the big one, the kind of the big projection is kind of a cinematic experience. It's more about experience. It's more about immersion. And the themes in the kind of big projection are more tied to ideas of first-person experience, right? So like both characters that you have are either a third-person character or it's a first-person drone. So you're experiencing that world. But here the theme was really to employ systems thinking and to look into systems. So not only to kind of design the community of people and declare them to be like utopian and highly technological, but also to kind of develop systems. And in this case, I worked in two systems. Like there is an ecological system that is operating, and then there is an economic. So it's like ecosystems, and they're interconnected. You can't really see them, except in the corner there is a kind of a counter that explains that it's the outcome of what happens behind the scenes. So in this case, we also wanted it to be like interactive, so that you can play. You can use a controller to play it and to understand it, and really understand it as a. It's if you spend maybe 20 minutes in this game, you can learn about the world in a way that is not the same as the kind of the film, because the film is really more about immersion.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke in terms of the film sequence that about particular perspectives, ways of seeing, point of view. And some of those pertain to the game, but the movement of the camera and the navigation is also different here. And one thing that's different is that, as you can see working now, the camera also operates as a clipping plane. Like, it can see through structures and perform live sections. And I feel like if one thinks about the history of medical imagery and what it means to like look at something which is alive, I feel you could call it like a vivisection. Like, it's alive, looking through, anatomically dissecting these kind of living human biological organism hybrids. And I mean, in a certain way, this pertains to a history of viewing in architecture, that it sees through stuff like the section. But whereas that is perhaps conventionally more of like a tectonic device, this seems to be, it's revealing these vital systems that are keeping this world together.
Yeah, and here we have, so we designed, I think, like 12 different airships and 10 different greenhouses, but they're all part of the same kind of language, and I think like 15 different pods, and so there is a whole roster, or really like a ecosystem of these things. But in the case of these, you can actually you can cut through them, you can understand their interior. And so this is something that when I thought about like what would a system simulation do, what it can do, it can actually also show you, things that you may not be able to see otherwise. And it's a continuous simulation that includes like a section box, which I thought was an interesting, for me, it's really an interesting way to maybe rethink the representational aspects of this kind of design. And this is, again, what influences then, what this produces are certain kinds of spaces that are nested, and certain kinds of ideas about color and pattern, which then react with this approach of seeing. But I think here the big really theme is you have agency as a player, and you're the one who can, like, you can go as deep as you want, and it's much deeper than what you might experience in like 15 minutes of just going inside. So this is what I was telling you at the beginning. We thought of the installation as having, I think, like 2 different time scales. You can just go inside and experience the film for 15 minutes, sit maybe in a beanbag chair, relax, and then go out, and that's the experience, that's the world. Or if you're more kind of Dungeons and Dragons kind of guy, you can go inside the game and read every description and look at every model and try to understand like how the world really works.
And in doing so, I mean, I feel like once that level of participation is activated, your agency as a subject becomes muddled with the agency of the many other protagonists who inhabit this world. And I'd say there's like a multi-species muddle. There's something, I mean, some of this way of thinking and navigating reminds me a lot of the thinking of Donna Haraway, and in general, philosophies of the post-human, and what it means to decenter a human-centered point of view and its economic systems and infrastructures, and think about what it would mean to integrate your agency with other species, other entities, whether they're like machine worlds that have been created by humans, or whether it's the natural world, or more likely cyborgian mixes of the two. And I feel in the act of playing, it's always playing with. It's a very relational experience, and I think that implies the kind of ethics. It's an ethics which is of the other, but the other not just as a human other, like other human players. It's also the other. It's like a xenopolitics, which involves also the world, natural living species, living systems. And in this way, I mean, I think you've spoken about the computer game Everything. where you can switch through those different scales. Is that a kind of reference that implies some of these things?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, but one thing that is also for me a really big reference here is that play is, what it does is introduces contingency in the act of observing the installation, right? Which is kind of a very pragmatic thing, actually. Normally, because in my other work, especially with students, I kind of deploy contingency and kind of indeterminacy as part of design process, as part of the creative act, let's say. But in this case, it was interesting to see how we can actually apply that also to the act of like experiencing an exhibition. And I think that's where play really, and simulation and this kind of approach comes as maybe an interesting destabilizer, because normally you kind of exhibit an object and there is a clear relation between audience and the artifact, but in play something gets muddled and things get a bit messier. I like this quote from Pierre Huyghe, that he doesn't want to exhibit something to someone, but he wants to exhibit someone to something. And I like that quote also because systems and things like video games, they may appear to have their own agency and they may appear to have their own kind of internal reality, but that becomes part of that engagement that you're talking about once you get into that. And that's play. Play is a fundamental kind of human experience. And it's the one experience that can actually push through any kind of rigid engagement that we may have. It's something that really enables you to kind of break through.
Also, there's play and there's play. Like you can play sweetly, you can play very violently, you can play quite viciously. And I think in the world of the computer game and the simulation, one encounters like all manner of play. And there's like very exploitative play. And I think this is one of the critical discourses around computer games, is their relationship to capitalism and the way in which many times they rehearse and amplify the worst aspects and the most dystopian narratives about accumulation, exploitation, and just death that is kind of intrinsic to the capitalist world system. And I feel like you've avoided those valences without falling into a kind of saccharine utopianism. It seems to me a really sincere and like meditative investment in joy, and this insistence that there should be positive optimism about kind of the world to come.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, this is so true, and it's also, another thing with games is that kind of reading is also prevalent, mostly in academia. This idea that games are considered to be somehow exploitative or the ultimate expressions and stuff like neoliberal politics, which is all true because they kind of go hand in hand with that era. But I think, especially in like indie games and also in many mainstream games now, there is another stream. And many people who are actually trying to make art and make kind of meaningful stories about our world, and think about it from that point of view, without monetization, without gamification, without these kinds of things which are totally fine in a way in their own context. But as any other technology, this also opens up like vistas of human experience and new possibilities of seeing. And so, but in terms of systems, I think one thing that games can really do well is expose you to systems and make you aware and make you kind of open to kind of understanding that, from that point of view as well. Yeah.
Back in the film again, there's an overlaying text that accompanies the world, which is like partly a stream of consciousness of the main protagonists as they go around, and it's a very beautiful text in many ways. It's quite lyrical. It refers to, at one point, a film by Chris Marker, Sans Soleil.
Yeah.
And, I thought one of the things that seems to me characterizes that film is like the loving gaze that it extends over, the loving kind of anthropological gaze of the camera at humans, like how beautiful they are in all their different sort of contexts. And, it reminded me of this, you can correct me on the authorship of this quote and where it comes from, the poem, all watched over by machines of loving grace. It seems to me to imply this idea that, the human predicament right now is a crisis. And for sure, machines and all of their systems are like partly involved in that. But there's a sense in which that the machine world presents the horizon of a kind of objectivity and sensitiveness which can be adequately attuned to the planet,
yes,
as a non-human entity. And it's this sensing layer and its acuity that is necessary and required in order to make decisions. Political decisions about the climate, decisions about the city, so that there's something, the planet becomes a more self-regulated entity. And, it seems that the world that you're instantiating, it seems to be a world in which this is happening. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's the best thing. This is exactly right. I think this loving gaze from Chris Marker, I think that's exactly what we try to work through. And so all watched over by the machines of loving grace, that was actually an earnest poem, as far as I understand. It comes from a certain point in time, like 60s, where there was a sense of optimism, there was a sense of the future that will come, that is actually really a loving future, It's not a dystopian future. That and this relationship with technology was one of kind of friendship, And I think to me this is really something fundamental that we have forgotten when we talk about like post-human. People understand post-humanism as some kind of cold, desperate, desolate thing that, or they just say, "Oh, don't worry about it. We'll just have machines figuring out everything." That's not to me the point. I think to me the point is always going back to this idea of like, when we created these things, it was supposed to be really friendly, actually, and it was an engagement with that kind of possible future that is a friendly future, and of course the politics of that is also might be considered to be naive, right?
Yeah.
But maybe naive is okay as well at some point. I think we can talk about dystopias and these ideas of how every representation almost of technology that we have now is completely under the purview of this kind of dystopian framing, which there is a lot of reasons for that, right? Everything that happens with the excesses of AI and automation and things that happen in the sphere of politics and everything. But I think maybe there is a way to kind of return to some idea of like animated, friendly future that doesn't want to murder you in your sleep. And
Are we seeing in some way a speculative construction of a fully automated luxury communism?
Well, yeah, but in this case we call it like acid communism after Mark Fisher's text, because it's like the idea is to kind of think about the future in a way that is open to the reality of human experience, that is not declaring everything to be the purview of the machine, right? Which I disagree with that. And yeah. I kind of disagree with this kind of reading of the post-human. I think post-human is going hand in hand with technology.
I mean, because people like Nick Land, Benjamin Bratton, they say things like what will survive of us will not be human, or the chemistry of alien ancestors storms within us. I mean, it's a very dark, and it's like an anti-humanism.
Well, I mean, I personally like to think about like this Mark Fisher text, Acid Communism, which kind of tries to instantiate like a optimistic, well, to some extent optimistic kind of reading of the possibility. And yeah, I think these other possibilities are maybe tied to a certain generation, like Nick Land and Bratton and other people from that generation. It's a different kind of framing. Yeah. Maybe there is a way that we can. There are new thinkers out there, like Federico Campagna that we were talking about, who think about ways of overturning the technological framing of the world through by introduction of like alternative ways of thinking about the world, and maybe going back to some kind of historical idea of thinking about magic as a possible, but not literally kind of stage magic, but kind of that. And this is what I would tie to idea of play. Play is that like possible escape, And there is a fantastic quote by René Thom, who was a French mathematician, when he's talking about how do you understand a black box? How you can understand a black box is only through play. There is no other way to kind of open it up, And I think this is that's maybe one of the things.
There's also, I mean, maybe we can open it up to questions in a minute. But, I was also thinking, the thing about a simulation or a game is that it's a second life. It's very definitely takes you out of the world you're in. It could be for different reasons, to escape, to refine, to transition. And, I'm also, speaking of collectives, hacker collective types, another group who is quite sort of close to my heart in a way is the Invisible Committee. Yeah. And I think one of their texts is Now. It's the title Now, and it's a call to the non-suspension of action. It's a call against hope. Not to hope in the future, but to attack it now, to take direct action.
Direct action.
And, I feel that, to me, that really resonates with the present moment. Also here at SCI-Arc, and, because the gallery is in the context of our building and of our community and of the studio projects and other kinds of research that are happening right now. And so I think it also, it speaks to its own community. And I'm like kind of interested in how you see this work in relationship to, your studios, to your kind of students. And because it really resonates with me with an idea of intervention and a kind of immediacy. In this essay, Tentacular Thinking, Donna Haraway, actually I think she is quoting someone else, speaks of the need to form on-the-ground collectives capable of inventing new practices of imagination, resistance, revolt, repair, and mourning, and of living and dying well. Do you see that this is the kind of fulfillment of what is happening here is now, and it's on the ground?
I mean, it's probably not a fulfillment, but it's kind of a way that I can see going through that is I see it as going through it, rather than going around that. As you spoke about avatarization and the idea that kind of the second life, which is a like dominant discourse around that. Well, I think we have to go through it. And in order to find that kind of loving gaze, did you know that Chris Marker had a museum that he designed himself in Second Life? Right? I mean, it's really interesting. Second Life is actually was a online community that started like 2004, and he was an extremely active member, and he had a museum that he designed there. So I'm just telling you this because this is what I think about it. I think to me it's a little bit, it's impossible to step aside and say let's not engage with the virtual and let's kind of do direct action in real space, because I do think that we are going through it as like globally. So I think if we find ways to go through it and kind of free ourselves maybe from the tyranny of systems by unmasking them and by starting to play with them and by starting to imagine new ways of engagement and new politics and, you know, even through aesthetics, right? Which I think one of the main themes of this project really is aesthetics. and that's for a reason, because that's a political idea, right? To me.
Unmasking the tyranny of systems and play. I think let's do it. So thanks, Damjan. So let's open it up for questions.
Yeah. If someone has any question, please.